Well, hi, it's Professor Jen. Welcome to our really tail end of my tapings. I've had such a wonderful time selecting these subjects, and I appreciate the time that you spend, preparing the coursework, preparing for chat, the assignments, everything else. It's really been such a wonderful adventure. And so thank you again, always, to Captioning Services, always helping me get everything just perfect so I can have equal access of material for everybody at the same time. So, I love to start out discussing my picture, right? I always have a little picture. I love the visual. And I love this visual in particular because you see, we don't see much of the person behind the help sign. All we see really is this sign that says help, very startling, very obvious that the person needs some kind of assistance. My discussion today is going to be, of course, the houseless, the homeless, this how it is that media addresses the houseless and the homeless does really a great disservice sometimes to the real issues. Media, pop culture, 1960s. I can go back that far and feel confident in my discussion for you today. 1960s, homelessness was sort of a different adventure. It also had persons that were your age, college age, in the middle of trying to understand the Vietnam War. Okay. Uh, Traveling across the country, living itinerantly. I used the word in the previous lecture cast coffee table series. I said the word nomadic. 1960s were a different place. People were sort of soul searching, trying to find themselves, make sense of all of these new ideas, new constructs in the backdrop of a very long draft, of a very long war. I remember that just very, very minimally. I was in grade school and I would hear about people talk about their brothers being drafted, and I'd have these classmates. It was terrible. I'd have these classmates and they would cry in the playground. They'd say, "Oh, my father hasn't gotten out of bed in days. My brother has to go to the draft." And they kept referencing Vietnam. I didn't even know where that was globally on a map. It just felt very far away. And after about a year or two, I started to come to terms. It's 5, 6, 7 years old that people went and they just didn't come back. So the country in the 1960s, many young people, they were trying to find themselves. So they were living out of a backpack. We had this phrase called hippies, living out of a backpack, carefree, that kind of thing. 1970s, we started to see many persons portrayed, especially in the media, not the Woodstock image we were given in the 1960s. The media started to show us what homelessness, houselessness looked like from the perspective of pop culture in the media at that time. And it was filled with uh, uh, characters in television and film that usually were from the underbelly, persons that were active addiction, alcoholic, heroin. At the time marijuana was considered, a big anti-drug discussion. Here we are all these years later and it's legalized in New York State. But back in the 1970s, marijuana was going to be the peril of us all. It was going to ruin our brains, all these other things, etc. It was the gateway drug. This is what they said. They said that it was the gateway to heroin, cocaine, opiates, etc., opium. So we would see all these little sort of cautionary tales and drama television shows. There were all these police shows, especially, that gave us all these very interesting messages in media and pop culture that, you had one joint and it's a matter of time you'll be on the street. And we would see persons with mental health issues. That was another explanation in the 70s, especially the 1980s. Let's go up in decades, the 1980s, especially when pharmacology and the introduction of different kinds of drugs for different kinds of mental health issues were given. The more drugs that were prescribed, the more that we were emptying out as a society all these mental health uh, institutions, confines, housing opportunities, and very often persons that were homeless. So they were called, the crazies are in the street, very mean. But this is what we were told in pop culture at the time, especially portrayal in media and art, music, rap music, talked very often about the homeless in the 1980s. And we saw the whole creation of the homeless and how we understood them is a very negative experience. The minute you heard homeless, houseless, people started to band together. They pulled out NIMBY, which is, not in my backyard, and people would then have all these community meetings. This went on across the country, by the way. This is not a Rochester, New York discussion. This is really a global discussion in the United States, how people still view the homeless and the houseless rather than looking at a person like I gave you this picture where the sign says help. I'm sitting here, it's cold, it's hot, I don't have clothing, I don't have the right medication, I don't have any food, and I have a sign and the sign says help. If I could have helped myself, I wouldn't be sitting here. So many years in my career I've helped the homeless, the houseless, persons that are nomadic, itinerant, people that for some reason or a variety of reasons can't seem to really lock in and put it together. The media has brought us all of these characters. I can think of hundreds of characters, police shows, drama shows, hospital shows, where there's always this homeless or houseless person, and it's just some insurmountable reason why they're living in the street. And I came to learn that that's just not always true. Sometimes it's just one little situation that causes somebody to be living nomadically, itinerantly, or to be just thrust out into the street. But we really don't hear those stories often. I can give you some examples where we do not see these examples in pop culture and or media, etc., entertainment, because the value of the story is probably too painful to tell. The value of the story also requires understanding why it is that even the persons closest to them will not help them. I know of a case here in Rochester, definitely a 25, 26-year-old person lives with their mother when they're taking their medication. And when the 25, 26-year-old person decides not to take their medication for bipolar and a variety of other mental health issues, things turn very violent. And the violence begins in their apartment setting. And the parent says, I can't live with you like this, and you're going to have to leave the confines of our residence, our apartment, because I'm A, scared of you, B, the neighbors are complaining, and C, the police are here all the time because of your behavior and inability to continue to take the medication, whether it's because you don't want to, you don't like the way it makes you feel, or you don't feel you need it, is causing such consternation that I have to throw you out. And so in this particular case, I wind up seeing this person very often still in the neighborhood here in this particular region, and they would like to be able to go home. But of course, what I just described to you, the parent is just too petrified and cannot force this adult child to take the medication. So the adult child, we'll call this person M. M lives in a variety of homeless, houseless shelters. One day might have an abundance of clothing, another day maybe somebody took M's clothing. Some days M has no food because M does not meet the curfew status of a low barrier homeless shelter, meaning low barrier means that there aren't many rules between the shelter and the person that needs the services. So sometimes that curfew could be 10 o'clock at night, but guaranteed 10:01 at night, the door is locked. Nobody cares what your story is, and you're going to be sleeping in the street. Here in Rochester, they sleep very often in the garage tunnels. They sleep often in the garages of hospitals and abandoned office buildings. I know many sleep in two particular tent cities. I'm not going to give the location. It's unfair to those persons who are already struggling. They sleep in tents. You know how cold it is. It gets here in Rochester windy. Sometimes they wind up to be nocturnal awake persons, and they sleep during the day on buses, and the bus drivers don't say anything as long as they're not bothering anyone. Or they sleep in congregate settings. There aren't too many malls left, so they really can't go to the mall and stay in the food court all day. Starbucks changed the policy that you can't sit there without a purchase. So if you don't have, say $3 to buy a coffee, you're not sitting in Starbucks either. Many of them sit at the libraries because, as long as you're quiet and you have a book in front of you and you're not doing anything to upset anybody or, interrupt daily business, there are many that sit in the library all day with a book in front of them and they're actually sleeping. And and then they're up at night all over the city of Rochester and little surrounding areas, just sort of, being on guard and not sleeping and just sort of being mindful and wakeful because, very often they're victims of crime. We don't see that very often portrayed in media because it just doesn't seem to be, uh, part of the story. So many of the people I've worked with over the decades, they're raped in the street. That's men and women. Also non-binary persons that are transitioning. Doesn't matter what the gender is. People are often beaten for no reason because they're in the street. People are often mugged or their things are set on fire, or sometimes in some cases they're set on fire or they wind up filmed and videoed where people enjoy sort of showing the sad aspect of their life and making fun of them, ridiculing them, especially if they're in the middle of a mental health crisis. I can think of many examples, people I've worked with, that it might have had a schizophrenic episode, schizophrenic reaction trigger, where they're talking to themselves or they're fighting in the wind, somebody imaginary to us, but in their mind, they really do see this person in front of them. Media really doesn't show us that side. Usually, media and pop culture has delivered for us last 4 or 5 decades a reason to blame, in my opinion, the person who winds up homeless and or houseless. I'll give you some examples. Again, that little frog in my throat, please excuse me. I'll give you some examples. Very often in New York State, children age out of the foster care system at 21. So at 21, the magic door opens and you're thrust into the world. So if you have no parents, for whatever reason, whether they're incarcerated, deceased, houseless, homeless. They've abandoned all of our topics, right? Femme fatale. Uh, they've decided they don't want to be a parent anymore, whatever their reason is. They now have a child that's 21 that has been in the system on and off, probably more on than off. And 21 comes, and instead of a big birthday party, the person finds themselves alone into the world and to navigate for themselves. Very often we see the at-risk youth transition automatically into the at-risk adult because there's no bridge program. There's no place where somebody catches you at the doorway at 21 and says, gee, you still have the same issues of no support, emotional, financial, spiritual, uh, physical support, etc., housing. We didn't resolve that in this situation until 21. Why should we expect this to be any different? So many of the people that I have met over the years that are homeless at 21, they actually had a homeless houseless story way before. But this is the part of the story that, sort of gets chopped off, lopped off. Nobody wants to hear it. And then we then go to a new place in society. I've seen it before in the court structure, police departments, where we say, oh, well, you can't blame your family for the rest of your life, what you don't have at 21. But these people don't have the foundational skills. They don't have the ability to really discern between, survival and having any kind of a everyday aesthetic in their life. They're put in these situations where they really have zero preparation and they really have nobody to call to ask for advisement, nothing. That door has been closed. So that's one population that we never seem to want to tell that story. So much of this class, we began in the beginning telling all these stories. Why is it that we keep telling particular stories over and over again? In this whole discussion of the houseless, the homeless, I still sort of think in 2025, we still as a society, we still want to blame the person who is houseless and or homeless. Look at the person who might come back from a war, who might come back from some kind of professional military service. Maybe their relationship fell apart. Maybe their spouse moved on while they went to war. There are many persons that wind up houseless, homeless, because they come back to their life thinking that their life will be the same as they left and it isn't. In fact, I know many people here in the city of Rochester through the Veterans Administration, Veterans Association, and related programs that men, women, they went off to go into the service. They left a husband, a wife, a spouse, a significant other partner, and thinking that, everything would be fine when they got home, and they returned home and nobody's there. Uh, People have vacated, they've moved on to other partners, and yet failed to tell the person who was in the military. That could be so devastating to so many. I've seen it on the street that they come home to the address they thought was theirs. It's no longer theirs. And then the neighbors don't want to open the door because they don't want to get involved. This isn't a Rochester issue. This is a national issue in the United States. So many veterans tell the same story. Nobody opened the door. And here they would say, well, where are my kids? And people would say, I don't want to get involved. Don't ask me. And then they go to their parents, their siblings' homes and say, I'm dealing with the shock of not being able to find my family. They've left or they've moved on or they don't want me back or whatever it is. And those family members don't open the door. The siblings, the parents, they say, we don't know what you were exposed to. We're afraid of you. We have reasons to be suspect of you, whatever. And so many of these veterans just wind up in the street. We see so many of them in the state of Washington, state of Montana, Colorado, New York State, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that are just living itinerantly, living nomadically. These people all had families. They had people at one time that cared deeply for them. What changed? In media, we see these very negative portrayals of people that come back with PTSD, that come back, tremendously violent. We seem to want to tell that story over and over again. We don't want to tell the story, I think, in my opinion, in film, in literature, of the person who is just sincerely struggling, the weak side of the persona. I think often there's a book. He also came to RIT many years ago. If you need a summer read, it's a very good book. It's actually a memoir. I have to correct myself. And I spent a little time with him while he was at RIT. Lovely, lovely writer, lovely, lovely person, excellent speaker. His name is Anthony Swafford. He wrote the memoir Jarhead, all about his time while he was in the Marines. He talked a lot about all these persons that he served time with. He wasn't much older than all of you in this class. He talked about failed relationships and people coming back, never feeling that they quite fit in, feeling very lost, feeling abandoned from community, abandoned from self, abandoned, mismatched from religion, philosophy, education. That time went on for everybody else and they were able to make all these milestones, yet their time sort of like froze in place. Similarly to what I discussed in the last lecture cast coffee table series about the sort of the concrete landscape, that do people just move on? Is it really that easy that we all just move on? I also look at the population, criminal population that comes from facilities, that comes from jails, pre-release, post-release, post-incarcerative services, post-defined housing for persons that come from penal institutions, persons through Department of Corrections in New York State. That doesn't always happen either. Or on paper, everybody puts down an address, and clearly that's not what happened because I find so many of these people on the street. They're living in the street. They often tell a very sad story that they'd rather commit crime. This always baffled me, that life on the street was so hard emotionally, physically, financially, philosophically, religiously, etc., that they'd rather commit another crime to go back to facility. Can you imagine that so many people sit in jail counting down the days that they can get out? And I work with people that say, oh, if I just commit a couple, two, three crimes, I can get myself another year or two where I get three hots and a cot. I get medical attention, I get dental attention, I have friends, I have holidays, I have clean clothing, I have television, I have a bed to sleep in. I'd rather be in prison. That's how peculiar it all seems to me, that we have such a large segment of the population that would rather be in facility after they've been in facility. Can you imagine the word recidivate? They'd rather be back in facility. They'd rather be back in a hospital. They'd rather be back in a high barrier situation. High barrier, meaning that there's a lot of rules between the person and where it is that they're sleeping, staying, living, etc., functioning. A lot of rules. That they'd rather live in these kinds of construct than be individual, because to be individual and independent, it's just not possible. So I don't think the media does a very sufficient job in pop culture telling all of the sides of the story about why it is that people are houseless, homeless, why it is that, so many of us might think, oh, they're just one shower away from a job. No, they're not one shower away from a job. There are so many situations. Even if I were to have unlimited showers and clean clothing right off the rack from Old Navy, say, right, as an example, Target. People don't want to work with the houseless, the homeless. People don't want to work with the post-incarcerate. People don't feel comfortable working with people who have been living in institutional environments for many years. I don't know what kind of a reception people get continuously, but I know it's not working. There are so many jobs that are currently unfilled, but so many employers don't want to take the risk of hiring people that you and I might see as one shower away from rejoining society, one paycheck away from being in an apartment and being independent. You know, people don't feel that comfortable re-inviting certain persons back to the table, back to the landscape. I think often of different countries that have nomadic populations, and I'll speak just very temporarily on this one, just to give you an example. There's the Roma population in Italy. There's the Roma, R-O-M-A, Roma population in Spain, the Roma population in Romania, the Roma population in Greece, in Turkey, where else? Macedonians. Uh, People don't want them to be integrated into general society. They don't want to offer employment to the Roma population. They don't want Roma children to come into general population. Why? I don't really understand all of the nuances. Why? Is it that they feel that they are insignificant, that they feel that they don't share the same values, being itinerant, being nomadic, as persons that are, what could we say? I want to phrase this very carefully and meaningfully for us. Persons that are far more established. Yes, established, in the landscape, in the mainstream. So is it that we continue to push away populations that we don't understand, that we feel aren't living the same way that we're living? We're sort of in interesting times here in 2025. But I think, again, we see this really globally. We see this internationally, that there always seems to be this group of persons, no matter where we go. Again, YouTube, I refer to YouTube because I see so many wonderful documentaries that are done by people like you and I that don't have large budgets, but they bring us these little pieces of society in the world, and we get to see them, and we get to see it firsthand through video, etc., interview. And I say to myself, how do we bridge that gap? How do we get all of the homeless off the streets. I think too about what happens in Seattle, Washington, parts of Telluride, Colorado, parts of Los Angeles, all these tent cities. We have them here in Rochester. You know, it's certainly not glamorous, I'll tell you that. It's very frightening to think in many weather patterns, people are just surviving, holding on night after night, 4 or 5 pairs of socks and all kinds of coats and not the right nutrition and not the right emotional support, just like flung out there in a tent. I was watching a documentary. I think it was this Peter Santarillo that I've referenced before. He talked about the homeless population of persons between 20 and 30 years old in Los Angeles. And he interviews many as well in Kensington, Pennsylvania, people your age. And they just sort of live like in these burned out cars. And some of them have these advanced degrees in computer technologies, computer science, but they also have mental health issues or a little depression issue or bipolar. They don't have the right medication. And something very small, I'll give you a visual. I'll give you a graphic. Can you imagine having in front of you like a little glass of ice cubes and you go to fill the water, right? You all know what I mean. And we stop right to the top and we say, oh, I must sip this while it's still on the table because if I jiggle the glass a little, it's going to spill. Or we say, oh, it's a good thing I stopped pouring right then and there because one more moment of pouring, it would have overflowed. So really, I give you that example because it doesn't really take much to change the dynamic and the landscape of a glass and what goes in it to have an overflow. I sort of see the same with mental health, that sometimes we can have somebody that the vessel is fine, right? The glass great, got the right amount of ice cubes, but a little bit more water goes in there than we thought and it overflows. Really how challenging it is for all of us. At any given time, something can change so radically that I wonder to myself, how much would it really take emotionally, philosophically, for people like me, people like you, meaning differences in age, generation, to find ourselves really in a situation where we've either walked away from everything, we've lost everything, maybe too many people closed too many doors all too quickly, you know, and we find ourselves houseless and homeless. Where's that story? I want to hear that story. I don't always want to hear about, the drug addict that made all these faulty choices. I want to hear the story before that. Like what caused them to turn to drugs. That's the part of the story I'd like to hear about. But very often we don't want to tell that part of the story because it involves other people. It involves other people in the house. I see that often, It involves truth telling about the situation, the atmosphere in the household. It involves protecting other people that shouldn't be protected in the household. It involves new romances, sometimes of a parent or partner that says, sort of like Hansel and Gretel. Step parent comes in, says, I don't want this inherited family. Everybody has to scatter. I'm going to start, my new life with my new spouse. I didn't count on all this. And everybody has to sort of go to different mouse holes. That's the story I want to hear about. I want to also hear about the part of the story where people are given rules, right, within infrastructure, household, family settings. And very often young people might say, well, I didn't like the rules. I didn't like this new step parent. I didn't want to have to hear about, doing things a certain way. I didn't like this step parent sitting on my late parents' couch. That's the story I'd like to hear. I'd like to hear it from the beginning. And I'd like to hear all perspectives of the whole story. I think it would be a lot different if we started telling the whole story, the very big picture, not just the part with, well, and this person was on drugs and became houseless and homeless. No, no, let's rewind this a little. Let's back up and let's get the entire story right from the very beginning. So anyway, my dears, when you go to watch television and you go to watch shows, you read a wonderful fictional piece, a memoir, listen to songs, about isolation, abandonment, homelessness, houselessness. I think to myself, when you go to see them, could you keep in mind, gee, what is the whole story here? What is the whole picture? I mean, in kindergarten, we all didn't sit around and say, oh, you're going to be homeless. Oh, you're going to be houseless. All of us sort of had like this sort of standard measure of operation. We all had homes for the most part, you know. We had food, we had people that came to the auditorium. What happened? What happened in these people's lives that was so severe that the cutoff really became so intense and so permanent at times? I'll leave you with this thought. How many homeless, houseless funerals have I been to? Numerous, far more than I care to admit. And I look around, it's me, the funeral director, maybe one or two other people from the street, and that's it. We're all their family. You mean to tell me that all of the houseless homeless that I've dealt with as a caseworker here in Rochester, New York, are we going to say all of them live longer than their family? No, not possible. The stats just aren't even there to support that. Where were their neighbors? Where were their childhood friends? What was it that was so extreme that caused this complete and utter cutoff? What was it? That's what I'd like to see in pop culture media and how we tell the whole story. So with that, my dears, I hope you have a lovely weekend. I'm going off today to someplace called Letchworth Park. If you're ever in the area, I would suggest you try to get down there. It's sort of what they call the Grand Canyon of the Northeast. It's really sort of pretty spectacular. So I'm going to go there today with one of my sons, and we're going to do a little walking and see what kind of turkey vultures are out looking for all kinds of food, etc. What kind of little late winter, early spring campers there are walking around with their tents on their back hiking. So I love to see it before it gets very full of tourists, etc. I love it when it's very quiet and expansive. And it's just me and nature. So I wish you well always. I hope you got something out of this, some thought, when we see a homeless person, what is the whole story? And why is the split from establishment so severe? You have a good day. I hope you do something good for yourself. Bye bye.